we'll be review some of these major points, but I just think they do a good job with it. So let's give a little background. He was born in Macedonia. And he is a very interesting figure because this is Macedon, where he is from. And as it reiterated on the videos, he's considered to be one of the greatest, most brilliant military leaders in human history. I mean, that's a pretty big compliment, to say you are indeed the greatest of all time, so to speak. He, as a Macedonian general, he amassed a very impressive empire that stretched all the way from Greece to the Indus Valley. He changed the future of those he contacted, not just by taking over, but he introduced into those areas Greek culture and ideas. It must be noted that the study of Alexander the Great is somewhat influenced by the fact that most primary sources written about Alexander the Great and his campaign that scholars have today were written by the Greeks. How would that possibly influence it?
Could have made him more.
Absolutely. They're definitely going to be biased because they view him as one of the greatest leaders they ever had. And so it's kind of the George Washington effect, right? We blow these people up as being like just absolutely beyond human. There's a podcast that I've really grown to love this year. This lady, Ashley Flowers, who does the Crime Junkie podcast. If any of you like Crime Junkie, I know some of you do podcasts. She's probably one of my favorite podcasters anyway. She has a great voice. And she has a great pace with her podcast. Like, she doesn't get off on crazy trails that you're like, okay, nobody cares. Come back to the topic. But she did one called the Very Presidential. She did it like the 8 weeks leading up to the presidential election. And she took different presidents that people think about when they look back. They don't think about them accurately. And one of the ones she gave the example of is how George Washington is viewed throughout history as this really warm figure and father of the country and all these things, and how he was actually very cold. He did not like for people to touch him. He was very standoffish. He was not friendly, and things that we would think about with thinking about him, we would assume he was not those things, but he was. All right. So anyway, a little bit about Alexander the Great and his accomplishments. So what we have written about him, the sources that we have about him, were written by people that more than likely were huge fans. And so as we said, they may have exaggerated, and we know it's going to be biased. Now, bias is just something we naturally have. As people, we have biases. There are things we like better than others, right? And so that is a natural thing. Now, all right. So let's start with his father, Philip II. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a conqueror in his own right. He was pretty successful. And once Philip became king, he was determined to conquer Greece. That was his goal. And so he whips his army into shape using both Greek and Macedonian tactics. And he spends most of his time away from home on campaign. So daddy's out with the army, which at this time, these major leaders, that's what they would kind of do is, they would become leaders and then they would leave and they would go try to conquer the world. And so that's what Alexander's daddy is out doing, is he is trying to be this world conqueror. And what you actually see, Alexander the Great, fan? Yeah, okay. And so while he's away, daddy's a big drinker.
Oh.
And he has a lot of girlfriends.
Oh, ladies man. Oh.
And so because of those infidelities, it causes some tensions with his wife, Olympia.
I would see that.
You can see where that would be a problem, huh?
Yeah.
He's a drunk that likes other women.
That's not good.
And so she tells him that their only child together is not his son.
Ooh, snap. Boy, you talking about some drama. That's real life soap opera right there.
But as you watched in the video, who does she claim is the daddy? Zeus.
What? Oh, thank God.
So Zeus is the baby daddy. I mean, because then he can't beat her, right? Because it wasn't anybody in the kingdom. You blame it on Zeus. And so Zeus is Alexander's daddy. And as I said, if you've been told all your life that you are the son of a god, your ego might be, well, To what you?
Thunderbolt.
Oh, talking about Zeus. Zeus would thunderbolt you. Yeah. Jackson cracks me up. But so here's what he says. So Olympia says basically, this is not your son. This is my son. In fact, there are actually thoughts that perhaps their relationship was maybe a little too close. Yeah. So, yes. Now, once again, it's been a long time. Who knows? But it is actually strongly speculated that there might have been some inappropriate relationship there. And not just with Zeus. In 338 BC, Alexander is going to prove himself there.
What BC?
338. He proves himself to be a capable military leader. He's 18 years old, and Daddy lets him lead the cavalry in an attack during a battle. And because of what Alexander does, this is a hugely significant battle for Macedonia. In fact, it gives his dad control over almost all of Greece, his earthly father. Now, once Philip, Alexander's dad, has control of Greece and it's stable, he announced his purpose. He said, all right, now I'm going against the Persians. Remember the Persians that we talked about before, and we said they would be back? They're about to be back. So Philip's like, all right, we're going to take on the Persians. Now, why does Philip choose that Greece is not enough? You know, and you do see this with certain power-hungry people, right? Like Napoleon and this kind of situation where they get what you think they want, but then that's not enough. It's never enough. And however, Philip may have some legitimate reasons. You see, here's the deal. He wants to stay in power, and his Greek subjects want revenge. Because if you remember, the king Xerxes, back in 480, when we talked about Xerxes and the Persians, he and his people attacked the Greeks. And you talk about holding a grudge for a long time. It's been 150 years, right? And so because of this is Daddy Philip. This is Alexander the Great. All right. So because of this, Xerxes and what he had done, Philip gets talked into this by the people. They're like, we need revenge for our ancestors. And he's like, you know, if we did that, we could possibly pay for a larger army. And so he's like, let's do it. So he hoped he would gain all this money and he could get this bigger army. However, Philip never sees the beginning of this campaign because in 336, when Alexander is the ripe old age of 20, the Macedonian king, Philip II, was assassinated inside of a theater in the city of Aegea. Now, as the video told you, there are some questions as to whether or not Alexander and or his mother were involved. If you watch the movie Alexander that came out in 2004, you know, Olympia's all up in this. She kind of seems like that person who would be, though, right? Like, but I mean, you know, he was out whoremongering and drinking, so, you know. And she did have that whole relationship with Zeus. So it's kind of a thing. So when Daddy gets killed in the theater, Alexander easily ascends to the throne with the overwhelming support of the Macedonian army. Now, like I said, Alexander's involvement, that wouldn't surprise me. But Olympia, if she wasn't, she was probably ticked off. She was like, how did I miss getting in on that? Because she just, yeah, she strikes me as that kind. Now, one of the first things he does as king, this is so politically smart, is he orders the execution immediately of all the men responsible for his father's death. Why is that smart on two fronts?
They're going to kill him then.
Well, one, if they really did it, then, you know, he can say he revenged his father's death. If they didn't, dead men don't talk. That's right. And so he puts a note, you know, so basically you assassinate somebody, you didn't die. That's what's going to happen. So he does this very quickly. The beginning of his reign does not go easy for him. In fact, it's fraught with rebellion. Some believed that because Philip was dead, that maybe the Macedonian army is not as strong, and so they decide to test him. Don't you test him? And so what's going to happen is a revolt is going to be launched in 335. So a year later, a new revolt is launched. Without hesitation, Alexander climbed on that magical horse, and he rode off into the sunset to go quell the rebellion in the Balkans. He then returned to Greece, and there was another rebellion in the city of Thebes, and he's like, I got you too, Thebes. And he takes that on. Alexander destroyed the city. He's like, I'm not going to keep putting down all these little rebellions, so here's what I'm going to do. It's time to make an example. He destroyed the city of Thebes all the way to the ground. Sometimes you have to make an example, don't you?
Yeah.
But sometimes when you see somebody make an example, you're like, okay, cool. I don't want any of that. And surprisingly, after that, he had a pretty firm grip on the land of Greece. And people decided maybe he was as strong as his daddy. And they stepped back. So once he has this firm control on Greece, Alexander decides that it is safe to leave the area and to start his campaign against the Persians, just like his father had planned. And so this conquest of Persia is now a definite possibility for Alexander. It is going to happen. I mean, let's face it, he's already proven himself an able military leader here. And so what I want you to see, this is one of the illustrations of him. I did tell you that he had the two different colored eyes. I thought that was kind of cool, especially being Greek. Greek people usually have dark hair, darker eyes. And so this was something that kind of made him stand out anyway. Have you ever known someone who had two different colored eyes? I had a friend growing up. Do what?
I said Miss Martin.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. They're like two different shades of brown.
I have a friend growing up that had one blue and one green eye. It was something you didn't really notice if you weren't looking for, but when you knew that, you're like, it just really kind of stood out to you. He was born with the two different colors. But anyway, so pretty much what happens is Alexander has already proven himself to be a decent commander, and he's going to fight against King Darius III. Remember Darius the OK?
Yeah.
So that's who he fights for. Now, Persia is not in the best of shape, but they have control of a lot of territory. And so their power is kind of coming to an end. Alexander reads the room correctly, and he knows it's time to go. And so he and his army leave Greece in 334. And they cross into what today is known as Turkey. Now, in his army, when I picture armies leaving, a lot of times in my mind, I don't picture them the way that they were, because Alexander himself had 35,000 men in his army. To give you some statistics, he had 5,000 men that were on horseback or cavalry, and he had 3,000 that were infantrymen, that were on foot soldiers.
And the rest?
Infantry was 30,000. I'm sorry, I think I said 3. I'm sorry. 5 and 30. And this included members of not only the Macedonian army, but also Greek mercenaries that he had paid and who were ready to kill the Persians. Like, hey, cool, let's do this. Alexander also hired other men to go with him who were not fighters. What were they? Well, a lot of them were what was called a siege engineer. People who would design the attacks, game plans. He hired historians. He hired doctors. He felt like these people and their ideas would be the key to his success. The key to his success. So the Macedonian and the Persian armies met for the first time in the campaign of a city called Granaeus, I guess. So they meet here. The Persians were hoping that they could lure Alexander and the Macedonians across the river and kill him. But Alexander, once again, is a brilliant statistician, and he reads the room, and he realizes that they're across the river as part of a trap. And so Alexander does cross the river, but he gets the better of the Persians, and he wins the battle. The Macedonians are going to take over 2,000 people prisoner. Alexander sweeps down the coastline of Asia Minor, and by 333, he finds himself in northern Syria with Darius III, or as we call him, Darius the OK. Darius and his Persian forces were waiting for him at the city of Issus. Let's see. Yeah. Yes. They were waiting for Alexander at Issus. Now here the Macedonians and the Persians are going to fight their second major battle. And in this battle, Alexander and Darius III literally have this movie moment where they come face to face in combat. You know, in the movies that always happens, like with the big heroes, right? In reality, that doesn't happen because usually your big leaders are not sitting there in the middle of the thick of the battle because they could die. And at this point, Darius realizes when they come face to face that he has lost the battle and he flees. He took his army with him. The Greeks believed that proved that Darius was a coward. However, in all truthfulness, Darius was trying to save his army, right? Like, if you know that you're losing, the idea of fighting to the last man is kind of a valiant concept, but it's also kind of stupid.
I want to live.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. Like, if it's fighting to the last man, that's going to be me because I'm going to be running out ahead, right? You know. And so this is where Darius is. However, to be fair, he leaves so he can try to get better footing, a better position, and defend his empire. But he was in such a hurry that he left the women in his family behind. He's like, where's Lucy? He left the women and all the family behind him. So when Alexander found them, this is kind of one of those moments that I think I really like Alexander because he could have basically killed them, right? I mean, it's war. There's not like any Geneva Convention. There's no conduct rules here. You know, this is war. This is not the time that we're all pleasant and hold hands and right across the field singing free at last, and in the field of love here. That's not it. But instead, he does treat them with respect. He spared their lives, and he did not allow them to be tortured or to be touched or to be treated inappropriately in any way, which was not always the way that perhaps women who were hostages and things were treated. Oftentimes, they were basically treated as prostitutes. And so this is not what happens to Darius's family. And so I think that does kind of say something about Alexander's character, that at least he had maybe more morals than most people at that time. And so the Macedonians consider southward. And they end up in Egypt. In fact, they are stopped at a region of Gaza. The Gaza Strip is very significant even still today when you talk about like Israel and Palestine and the divisions there. And so they end up at Gaza. And there is a little stubborn pocket of resistance there, but they do eventually make it to Egypt. And when they get there, they found the inhabitants of Egypt really just don't care. I kind of like that. It's like, you know, we have Darius the OK, we have Darius the Great, we have Alexander the Great, and then you have the Egyptians, the apathetic. And so they get there, and they're just basically like, hey, we accept you as our new Pharaoh. And he's like, well, okay then. And so because there was no resistance, Alexander's like, I kind of like Egypt. And so he spent the winter of 332 hanging out with his men in Egypt. I mean, why not, right? Like, they're letting him be there. He's like, well, we mapped off a couple months to fight here, so let's just rest a little bit. Everybody go swim in the Nile. It's the only river that goes upside down. Alexander decided to keep his men occupied because he's like, you know, the idle hands, devil's workshop kind of thing. And so what he does is he has them to construct a new city, and he names it. And they made a pun about this in one of the clips I showed you about Alexander, that he liked to name cities after himself. And so he names the city in a truly humble fashion, Alexandria. No, this is in Egypt. He hires a Greek architect, though, to plan the city, and it becomes the center of Hellenistic or Greek culture. It illustrates the key to his occupation policy that he wants to impose Greek culture on the native populations. One of the pieces of Alexandria that is still considered to be the greatest piece of it is he builds a library. Now, to us, every little town has a library. Every school has a library. Probably some of you have some impressive collections of books at your house on topics that you find interesting, or maybe that you don't find interesting, or books that you don't even know how they got there. But that's because today books are cheap. You say books aren't cheap. Relatively, books are cheap, especially ebooks. Ebooks are just a few dollars, really. So here's where this happens. Alexander put together the world's largest collection of books at that time. And books at that time were extremely expensive because for my Civ 2 people, this is way before the Gutenberg press. This is way before books are printed. Every book is written by hand. And he has the largest collection the world had ever known at that point. Scholars from around the world gravitated to this library. And this shows you where Alexandria, excuse me. Scholars around the world. I thought I had a library picture. Let's see. Maybe not. All right. Okay. So these are illustrations of what it's believed based on the drawings that the library was supposed to look at. This was the lighthouse of Alexandria that came out of the library. This was the museum, some scholarly work of what the museum and library of Alexandria would look like. All right. So anyway, in 331, all good things must come to an end, right? So Alexander leaves Egypt. He travels through Palestine and into northern Iran because that was an area that it was easier for him to gain supplies for his men. And he takes his men to the city of Babylon. Now, once again, the city's inhabitants surrendered and welcomed him in a great ceremony. I mean, so far, this is going really well. Like Babylon. Which Babylon is where? Well, it's particularly, Babylon is Iraq. So, Iran. I always have to look them up. Because Iran is Persia, yeah. And so the city's inhabitants surrendered and they welcomed him in this great ceremony. And so after this, it's not enough for Alexander. He feels like he needs more. He wants to eliminate all possibility of revolt. And so he finds out that Darius is in the city of Ecbatana. I think I have that a little ways back. I may not. All right. So Darius is in the city of Ecbatana. It's Ecbatana. This is where good old Darius the OK is.
Haven't we talked about Ecbatana before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Today it's known as Hamadan. And Darius is there trying to raise another army. And Alexander's like, yeah, we're not doing this. And so he takes this opportunity in Persepolis to raise a summer harvest so that his men would have supplies. And then they go to Ecbatana.
That is smart.
So the year is now 329. And they're heading through the lands of present-day Afghanistan, chasing the new self-proclaimed king of Persia, which would be who? Who calls himself the king of Persia? Don't make this hard. Not Alexander, but who's the Persian guy? Darius III. So Darius is like, well, I'm the king of Persia now. So Alexander manages to move towards his army in India in 327 BC. Still struggling here. However, by 323 BC, Alexander was ready to embark on a second campaign to capture Darius and defeat all resistance. However, at the age of 33, his plans were interrupted. Darius came down with a sudden fever. He was worn down by years of battle, heavy drinking, and basically his body could not fight off the fever. Whatever was wrong with him, not completely sure. There's some speculation that perhaps he had typhoid or maybe even malaria. Don't know. Yeah. And Darius dies. Now,
That was a short reign.
it was. So let's connect the Greek world. So Macedonia was the region in northern Greece. And some historians believe that Macedonians were actually close cousins to the Greeks, while others think they were Slavic tribes. It's speculation. But whatever it was, they have come to appreciate and believe that Greek culture is the best culture that ever was. And the person who made that happen for them was King Philip. And so that is where it came from. Alexander in his stop made a few quick important stops included in his writings by his men. He actually stops at Troy before he continues on his conquest of the world. Now, if you go back to Queen Olympia, why she was so significant is she was a princess from the northwest corner of Greece. And so that's why he married a Greek woman, is because Philip was so obsessed with Greece. Now, let's go all the way back to Darius leaving to fight for Greece. Before Alexander left with his army, he went to a very significant location in a lot of the beliefs of the Greek gods. And that specific area, yes, was he goes to Delphi.
Oh.
Now, Delphi. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, Delphi was significant because there was an oracle who lived there. What is an oracle?
They tell the future by inhaling gas.
Yeah. So they tell the future, basically. Different ways. Sometimes they would read like animal bones. It was all sorts of stuff. But the oracle told him that he was invincible and he could not die. Yeah, told Alexander. And so this knowledge, no doubt, is going to give him great confidence. And so this is one of the reasons it's believed that Alexander is never stopping and he just continues to wear himself out and probably didn't even take the fever all that seriously. Now, it mentioned in one of the earlier videos that I showed you that Alexander was tutored by Aristotle, who is considered to be one of the greatest minds of this period. Because Philip wanted his son to have all of this great knowledge of Greece, and the best way he could do that would be to hire this Greek scholar. Alexander was said to have carried with him into every battle. Come in. Oh, I guess so. I thought it was on computer. Hey.
Hey, I need more help.
Okay. So it is said that as Alexander became so obsessed with Greek writing that he actually carried with him the Iliad. Remember the story, the Iliad, that we started our first Greek lecture with, and the Odyssey? The copy of the Iliad Alexander had was a handwritten copy, and it was Aristotle's personal copy in which Aristotle had made notes. And so he carried that with him all throughout his conquest, which I think is kind of a cool little story. He also was known to have had interactions with Plato and with Socrates, other great minds. So why does Alexander's conquest, why is it so significant? Well, this conquest spread this Hellenic or Greek civilization to bring changes throughout Asia and Egypt. The biggest change, though, was food, the agriculture that is going to be brought into the other areas. It's also going to bring large amounts of Greek immigration into these other cities. So in these new cities, in the Egyptian countryside, they would find themselves there. A lot of times they would do these traditional periods of land tenure where they would work there for a small amount of time and then they would leave It's basically like sharecropping, if you will. Now, and so where do we leave this? Well, the influence of non-Greeks and Greeks is going to be carried out by the movements of people. There is a major diaspora of both Jews and Egyptian culture that is going to be carried out, as well as Babylonian astrology. And all of that exposure to those new places is going to gain popularity among the Greeks. Both Greeks and non-Greeks continued traditional religious practices. And the Library of Alexandria is going to be the home for some of the greatest scientific discoveries of this early period. Advances are going to take place here in anatomy, physiology, and pathology. And in fact, it is at Alexander's library that astronomical measurements are going to be made that accurately determine the Earth's circumference, where a lot of math is going to be systemized as we know it today, and physics, huge advances in physics. And so we see where someone like Alexander the Great is going to change the world and spread Greek culture forever, really. And that is where we will leave off with Alexander. So where we will pick up with building this Hellenistic civilization is our next discussion will actually be on Rome. So, all right, so I'm going to add your assignment for